Hi, I'm Isabella, and 3 years ago, my sister Vivian stole my dream wedding venue and my fiancé Marcus on the same devastating weekend while our family celebrated her romantic spontaneity. I stayed silent, watching her plan my perfect day as her own. But their honeymoon in Bali became such a nightmare that she called me sobbing from a hospital bed, begging me to help her salvage what was left of her marriage. Now she's lost everything she stole from me, and I'm the one standing at the altar she can never approach again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Saturday in March. I was in my apartment kitchen, surrounded by wedding magazines and vendor contracts, my laptop open to 17 different tabs comparing floral arrangements. Marcus was supposed to arrive at 10 to help me finalize our guest list, but he'd texted saying he was running late. Nothing unusual. He'd been distant for weeks, claiming work stress, and I'd given him space, thinking he was just overwhelmed by wedding planning pressure. Vivian showed up instead, unannounced, carrying 2 coffee cups and wearing that smile she reserved for moments when she was about to ask for something significant. She'd always been the spontaneous one, the sister who could charm her way out of any situation, while I was the planner, the one who made detailed spreadsheets for vacation itineraries and kept color-coded calendars for everything from doctor appointments to dinner dates. "Bella," she said, settling onto my couch with unnecessary drama. "We need to talk about something important." She handed me one of the coffees, a peace offering disguised as sisterly affection. I should have known, then, that something was wrong. Vivian never brought me coffee unless she wanted something. "What's going on?" I asked, closing my laptop and giving her my full attention. The wedding planning could wait. Family always came first in our household, a lesson our mother had drilled into us since childhood. Always support your sister. Always put family first. Always forgive family no matter what they do to you. Vivian took a deep breath, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you react, okay?" Her voice carried that tone she used when she was about to deliver news she knew would hurt. I'd heard it before when she'd accidentally broken my grandmother's vase, when she'd forgotten to pick me up from school, leaving me stranded for 3 hours, when she'd borrowed my car and returned it with a dent she never explained. "Marcus and I have been talking," she continued, not meeting my eyes. "About you, about the wedding, about everything." My stomach tightened, but I stayed quiet, honoring her request to let her finish. "He's been having doubts, Bella. Serious? Doubts about whether you two are really compatible long-term." The words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to remain still, to listen, to give her the benefit of the doubt that she was trying to help me avoid a bigger mistake. "What kind of doubts?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "He thinks you're too controlling," she said quickly, as if ripping off a bandage. "The color-coded wedding binders, the detailed timelines, the way you've planned every minute of your honeymoon itinerary. He feels suffocated, like he's marrying his mother instead of his partner." Each word was carefully chosen, designed to hit my deepest insecurities about being too organized, too careful, too planned. I sat back, processing this information. Marcus had never said anything to me about feeling suffocated. We'd had our disagreements about wedding details, sure, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. He'd actually complimented my organizational skills multiple times, saying he loved how I could manage complex projects effortlessly while he struggled to remember to pay bills on time. "Why is he telling you this instead of me?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Vivian shifted uncomfortably, finally looking directly at me. "Because he's scared of hurting you. Because he knows how much work you've put into planning this wedding. Because he cares about you too much to destroy your dreams." She paused, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "And because he's developed feelings for someone else." The silence that followed felt eternal. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was telling me, trying to understand how my entire life could be crumbling, while I sat in my kitchen surrounded by wedding planning materials that suddenly felt like evidence of my own naivety. "Who?" I whispered, though something in her expression already told me the answer I didn't want to hear. "Me," she said simply. "It happened gradually, Bella. We were spending so much time together while you were working late at the law firm. He needed someone to talk to about his concerns, and I was there to listen. We never intended for anything to happen, but sometimes feelings develop naturally, organically, without anyone planning or controlling them." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. She was describing their relationship as natural and organic, while simultaneously destroying the planned, controlled life I'd built with Marcus. Everything she was saying felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation multiple times before delivering it to me. "How long?" I asked, my lawyer training kicking in, needing facts and timelines even in the midst of emotional devastation. 3 months, she admitted. "We tried to fight it, Bella. We really did. But love isn't something you can schedule or plan away. It just happens." She reached across the coffee table, trying to take my hand, but I pulled back instinctively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 months. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks to make partner at my firm, trying to secure our financial future before the wedding, my fiancé and my sister had been falling in love behind my back. While I'd been calling vendors and tasting cakes and addressing invitations, they'd been sharing intimate conversations and secret moments that had grown into something that was now destroying my entire life. "What about the wedding?" I asked, gesturing toward the pile of contracts and vendor agreements that represented months of careful planning and thousands of dollars in deposits. Vivian's expression shifted, and I saw something that looked almost like excitement flash across her face before she composed herself. "That's the other thing we need to discuss. The Grandview Estate venue, your dream location, they had a cancellation for next weekend." Marcus and I were thinking, since everything's already planned and paid for, since the vendors are all booked and the invitations have been sent, maybe we could take over the arrangements. It would save everyone a lot of trouble and expense. I stared at her, trying to comprehend what she was suggesting. Not only had she stolen my fiancé, but now she wanted to steal my wedding venue, my carefully curated vendors, my painstakingly planned celebration that I'd been dreaming about since I was 12 years old. "You want to have your wedding at my venue with my vendors, using my plans?" My voice was eerily calm, a courtroom composure that I'd developed through years of legal training. "It makes practical sense," she said quickly. "Everything's already arranged. The flowers, the catering, the photography, the music. It would be wasteful to cancel everything. And honestly, Bella, you know I've never been good at planning detailed events. You're so much better at that stuff than I am. In a way, you'd still be contributing to creating a beautiful wedding, just for different people." The audacity of her request left me speechless. She was asking me to gift wrap my broken dreams and hand them over with a smile, to be grateful for the opportunity to plan her wedding to my former fiancé using all the details I'd lovingly selected for my own special day. "What does Marcus say about all this?" I asked, though I was already mentally preparing myself for another devastating revelation. "He's outside," she said quietly. "In the car. He wanted to come up and explain everything himself, but we thought it might be easier if I talked to you first, sister to sister." She paused. "He feels terrible about how this happened, Bella. We both do. But sometimes life takes unexpected turns, and we have to be mature enough to adapt." I walked to my living room window and looked down at the street. Marcus's blue Honda was parked directly below my building, and I could see his silhouette in the driver's seat. He was looking up at my window, and when he saw me, he raised his hand in a tentative wave. The gesture was so familiar, so painfully normal, that it almost broke me completely. This was the man who'd proposed to me on Christmas morning, who'd spent New Year's Eve making elaborate plans for our future together, who'd held me while I cried about work stress and promised that everything would be better once we were married, and could face life's challenges as a team. Now he was sitting in his car, letting my sister deliver the news that he was leaving me for her, and wanted to use our wedding plans for their celebration. "I need time to think," I said, turning away from the window. "This is a lot to process." Vivian stood up, smoothing her dress with nervous energy. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But the venue situation is time-sensitive, and we need to let them know by tomorrow if we're taking over the booking. The deposits are non-refundable anyway, so it really would make the most financial sense." Even in the midst of destroying my life, she was concerned about deposits and financial sense. I wanted to scream at her, to throw her out of my apartment, to march downstairs and confront Marcus with all the fury and heartbreak I was feeling. Instead, I nodded quietly and walked her to the door. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "Bella," she said, turning back to me with tears in her eyes that looked genuine. "I'm so sorry this happened. I never wanted to hurt you. You're my sister and I love you. I hope someday you can forgive us and understand that sometimes love just happens in unexpected ways." After she left, I stood in my empty apartment, surrounded by the detritus of my ruined wedding plans, and made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I wasn't going to fight for Marcus. I wasn't going to beg him to choose me. I wasn't going to create a scene or demand explanations or try to compete with my sister for a man who had already made his choice. I was going to let them have exactly what they wanted, and I was going to watch very carefully as they discovered what they'd actually stolen from me. The next morning, I called Vivian before she could call me. "You can have the venue," I said. Simply. "And Marcus, and all the wedding plans. Consider it my gift to both of you." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought she might have hung up. "Really?" she finally asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Really," I confirmed. "But I have one condition. I want to help with the final preparations. I want to make sure everything is absolutely perfect for your special day." "Bella, that's so generous of you. Are you sure you're okay with this?" "I'm sure," I lied smoothly. "Family comes first, right? That's what Mom always taught us. I want you to be happy, Vivian. Both of you." What I didn't tell her was that I knew things about those vendors that she didn't. I knew which ones were reliable and which ones cut corners. I knew which details were crucial and which ones seemed important, but were actually meaningless. I knew the backup plans and emergency contacts and all the small details that could make the difference between a perfect wedding and a complete disaster. And I was going to make sure she got exactly the wedding she deserved. The week that followed was a masterclass in silent suffering disguised as sisterly support. I threw myself into perfecting every detail of what should have been my wedding, now transformed into Vivian and Marcus's spontaneous celebration of true love. Our mother called it beautiful forgiveness when I announced my decision to help plan their wedding. Our father praised my mature handling of a difficult situation. Extended family members whispered about my grace and selflessness, completely missing the calculated precision behind every smile I offered. I met with the florist on Tuesday morning, sitting across from Mrs. Chen in her fragrant shop surrounded by roses and peonies that I'd originally selected for my own bouquet. "I want to make some adjustments to the arrangements," I told her, pulling out a notebook where I'd carefully documented every change I planned to make. "My sister has different tastes than I do." Mrs. Chen looked confused. She'd worked with me for months, knew every detail of my vision, understood the symbolic meaning behind each flower choice. "But Isabella, these arrangements were perfect. You spent so much time selecting each element, explaining the significance of the white roses for new beginnings, the baby's breath for pure love, the eucalyptus for protection and healing." I know, I said calmly. But this isn't my wedding anymore. It's theirs. And I want it to reflect their personalities perfectly. I opened my notebook to a page covered with detailed notes. Let's substitute the white roses with red ones. Much more dramatic, much more passionate. And instead of baby's breath, let's use wax flower. It's beautiful, but it's known for being incredibly fragile. It wilts quickly under stress and doesn't photograph well under certain lighting conditions. Mrs. Chen frowned, clearly uncomfortable with changes that went against her professional expertise. Isabella, wax flower won't last the entire day, especially with the outdoor ceremony you've planned. By the reception, the arrangements will look tired and droopy. Perfect, I said, maintaining my serene expression. That's exactly the look we're going for. Authentic and natural, not overly planned or controlled. I made a note in my book. Also, let's change the ceremony arch from the classic white roses and greenery to something much more elaborate. I'm thinking a massive display with birds of paradise and tropical foliage. Really make a statement. What I didn't mention was that birds of paradise were notorious for attracting wasps and bees, especially during outdoor ceremonies. The elaborate tropical arrangement would be stunning in photos, but problematic for anyone with allergies or insect phobias. Marcus had mentioned once, casually, that he was terrified of bees after being stung multiple times as a child. It was the kind of detail a loving fiancé would remember and accommodate. The kind of detail a betrayed ex-fiancé might use strategically. The meeting with the caterer was equally productive. I'd originally selected a menu that reflected both Marcus's and my favorite foods, a carefully balanced selection that accommodated various dietary restrictions among our guests. For Vivian's wedding, I suggested modifications that seemed generous, but were actually calculated to create maximum discomfort. Let's change the seafood selection, I told the caterer, reviewing the menu we'd finalized months ago. Instead of the grilled salmon with herb butter, let's do raw oysters and shrimp cocktail. Much more elegant and sophisticated. I knew that both Marcus and Vivian's father had shellfish sensitivities that weren't quite allergies but caused digestive discomfort. Raw shellfish at an outdoor wedding in warm weather was a recipe for potential food safety issues. Are you sure about serving raw shellfish to elderly guests? The caterer asked. Your original menu was much safer for a diverse age group. My sister loves taking risks, I replied smoothly. She's always been the adventurous one in our family. This menu reflects her bold personality perfectly. I made another note. Also, let's substitute the chocolate wedding cake with something more unique. How about a tower of cream puffs? Very French, very sophisticated. The caterer looked skeptical. Cream puffs are beautiful, but they're extremely temperature sensitive. With an outdoor reception and no adequate refrigeration setup, they could become food safety hazards within a few hours. That's what makes them so special, I said. They represent the delicate nature of love, how it needs to be cherished and protected. What they actually represented was my understanding that Vivian had chosen an outdoor venue with minimal refrigeration capabilities during one of the warmest weeks of the year. My conversation with the photographer required more subtle manipulation. David Rodriguez had shot 3 of my friends' weddings, knew my style preferences intimately, and had spent hours discussing the vision for my special day. He was confused when I called to modify the shot list for what he still thought was my wedding. Isabella, I'm not sure I understand what's happening, he said when I met him at his studio. Your fiancé called yesterday asking about timeline. Changes, but he seemed unfamiliar with all the details we'd discussed. And now you're here asking me to completely revise our shooting schedule? There have been some changes in the wedding party, I explained vaguely. Nothing major, just some adjustments to accommodate everyone's preferences. I handed him a revised timeline that looked comprehensive but was actually designed to create chaos. I'd like you to focus heavily on getting ready shots. Really capture the pre-ceremony preparation in detail. What I didn't mention was that I'd specifically scheduled the photography timeline to begin an hour earlier than necessary, ensuring that hair and makeup would be rushed, that getting ready photos would capture stress and chaos rather than joyful anticipation, and that the bridal party would be exhausted before the ceremony even began. Also, I continued, I'd like you to prioritize candid shots over posed portraits, really capture the authentic emotions of the day. This sounded artistic and meaningful, but I was actually requesting that he document every unguarded moment, every flash of stress or irritation that would inevitably occur when carefully laid plans began to unravel. The most delicate conversation was with the wedding planner, Sarah Matthews, who had become almost a friend during our months of collaboration. She knew me well enough to sense that something was wrong when I called requesting a meeting to adjust. A few final details. "Isabella, honey, are you okay?" she asked the moment I walked into her office. "You look exhausted, and frankly, some of these change requests are concerning me. The timeline modifications you've proposed would create unnecessary stress for everyone involved." "I'm fine," I assured her, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I've just been thinking about what kind of wedding would really reflect the couple's personalities, and I realized my original plans were too rigid, too controlled. This should be more spontaneous, more authentic to who they really are." Sarah reviewed the timeline I'd submitted, her brow furrowing with professional concern. "Isabella, this schedule has the ceremony starting during the hottest part of the day, with no adequate shade for elderly guests. The reception timeline leaves no buffer time for delays, which means any small problem could cascade into major issues. And you've scheduled the couple's grand exit during peak traffic hours, which could leave guests stranded in the parking lot." "Perfect," I said, making notes in my planner. "That sounds much more exciting than my boring, over-planned version. Sometimes the best celebrations are the ones where you just go with the flow and see what happens." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, clearly recognizing that this wasn't the meticulous, detail-oriented bride she'd been working with for months. "Isabella, I have to ask, are you sure you want these changes? Some of them seem designed to create problems rather than solve them." "I'm absolutely sure," I replied firmly. "This wedding should reflect the couple's true nature, and if that means embracing a little chaos and unpredictability, then that's what we should do." What Sarah didn't understand was that I knew exactly what kind of chaos I was creating. Every modification I'd requested was based on months of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the vendors, the venue, and the personalities involved. I wasn't randomly sabotaging their wedding. I was systematically ensuring that they would experience exactly the kind of day that their hasty, thoughtless decisions deserved. The venue walkthrough was my final opportunity to set the stage for their perfect day. I met with the estate manager, Patricia Williams, on a sunny Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to review last-minute details, but actually to implement the final phase of my careful planning. "I want to move the ceremony location," I told Patricia as we stood in the beautifully landscaped garden where I'd originally planned to exchange vows with Marcus. "This spot is lovely, but it lacks drama. Let's use the hilltop location instead." Patricia looked puzzled. "Isabella, we discussed this extensively when you booked. The hilltop is beautiful, but it's completely exposed to wind and sun. There's no natural shade, no protection from weather, and the acoustics are terrible without additional sound equipment that wasn't included in your package. That's what makes it so romantic," I said, walking toward the hilltop area that offered stunning views, but would be absolutely miserable for guests during an afternoon ceremony in late spring weather. "Love should be bold and unprotected, don't you think? And if people can't hear the vows clearly, it just makes the moment more intimate and personal." Patricia followed me reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with changes that violated basic event planning principles. "Isabella, I have to advise against this. The wind patterns up here are unpredictable. Your decorations could be destroyed, your guests could be uncomfortable, and the photography will be challenging with the harsh lighting." Sounds perfect for a couple who fell in love unexpectedly, I replied, making final notes in my planning binder. Sometimes love means taking risks and embracing whatever comes naturally, even if it's not what you originally planned. The irony of my words wasn't lost on me. I was describing Vivian and Marcus's relationship while simultaneously ensuring that their wedding day would demonstrate exactly what happened when people made impulsive decisions without considering consequences. During these vendor meetings, I also learned details about their relationship that made my strategic planning even more precise. Marcus had apparently expressed concerns about the cost of the wedding, not understanding that most deposits were non-refundable and that my carefully negotiated vendor agreements couldn't simply be transferred without financial penalties. Vivian had assured him that everything was already paid for, not realizing that several key services required final payments that she hadn't budgeted for. They were planning a honeymoon in Bali, funded by the money Marcus had been saving for our down payment on a house. Vivian had convinced him that experiences were more important than property investments, that they should live boldly and romantically rather than planning cautiously for the future. She'd booked them into a luxury resort that specialized in adventure activities, not knowing that Marcus was prone to motion sickness and had specifically told me he never wanted to go anywhere that involved boats, helicopters, or extreme sports. The final detail that made my planning complete was discovering that they'd lied to both sets of parents about the timeline of their relationship. They'd told everyone that their feelings had developed recently, after Marcus had already decided to end our engagement. But I'd done some investigation, reviewing credit card statements and social media activity that Marcus had forgotten to hide, and discovered that they'd been involved for much longer than 3 months. They'd had their first secret dinner date, while I was working late preparing for a major trial. They'd spent a weekend together at a bed and breakfast while I was visiting my college roommate in Chicago. They'd been building their relationship for nearly 8 months, carefully hiding it from everyone while I planned our wedding, and worked myself to exhaustion, trying to secure our financial future. The betrayal was so much deeper than I'd initially understood. This wasn't a case of unexpected love or uncontrollable feelings. It was a calculated deception that had been planned and executed, while I trusted them both completely. They'd sat through family dinners together, attended my work events as a couple, even helped me with wedding planning, all while conducting their secret affair and probably laughing at my naive assumptions about loyalty and honesty. This knowledge transformed my approach from petty revenge to strategic justice. They deserved to experience exactly the kind of relationship they'd built. Together, one based on deception, poor planning, and the willingness to betray others for immediate gratification. Their wedding day would be a perfect reflection of their characters, and their honeymoon would demonstrate what happened when people made major life decisions based on lies and impulses rather than genuine compatibility and mutual respect. By Friday evening, everything was perfectly arranged. Every vendor had their modified instructions, every timeline had been adjusted to create maximum stress, and every detail had been calibrated to showcase the true nature of hasty decisions and borrowed dreams. I packed my bridesmaid dress, the same one I'd originally selected for Vivian to wear in my wedding, and prepared to attend the celebration of everything I'd lost, and everything they were about to discover they'd never actually won. The morning of what should have been my wedding dawned with the kind of oppressive humidity that makes elegant hairstyles impossible and formal clothing unbearable. I woke at 5 a.m., not from anxiety or sadness, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every carefully orchestrated detail was about to unfold exactly as I'd planned. While Vivian was probably still sleeping peacefully, dreaming of her perfect stolen day, I was already reviewing my mental checklist of everything that would go beautifully, catastrophically wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, the wedding planner, sent at 4:30 in the morning. Isabella, emergency situation. The florist just called. Half the tropical arrangements wilted overnight in storage. The wax flower looks terrible. Can we make substitutions? I smiled, typing back with fake concern. Oh no. Well, Vivian wanted authentic and natural. Maybe we can supplement with some wildflowers from the estate grounds? She'd love that rustic, unplanned look. What Sarah didn't know was that I'd specifically requested that Mrs. Chen prepare the delicate arrangements 2 days early, knowing that waxflower and tropical blooms couldn't survive that timeline without professional cooling systems that her small shop didn't possess. The emergency was precisely on schedule. I arrived at the Grandview Estate at 7 a.m., ostensibly to help with setup but actually to witness the beginning of what I privately called Operation Authentic Experience. The venue looked stunning in the early morning light, the hilltop ceremony site offering breathtaking views that would photograph beautifully until the afternoon sun turned it into an exposed, windswept nightmare for guests. Patricia, the venue manager, approached me immediately, her professional composure barely masking her stress. Isabella, I'm so glad you're here early. We're having some challenges with the ceremony setup. The wind on the hilltop is much stronger than anticipated, and we can't get the decorative arch to stay stable. Also, the sound system is having feedback issues because of the acoustics up there. I'm sure you'll figure something out, I said, cheerfully adjusting the bridesmaid dress that felt like costume armor for the performance I was about to give. Vivian always says that the best celebrations are the ones where you adapt and go with the flow. Maybe we could move some of the sturdier decorations from other areas to help anchor everything. What I was suggesting would strip decorative elements from the cocktail reception area, creating a domino effect of aesthetic problems throughout the entire event. Patricia looked overwhelmed but nodded, dispatching her crew to begin the complicated process of relocating decorations that had been specifically placed for optimal visual impact in their original locations. The bridal party began arriving at 8 a.m. for hair and makeup, an hour earlier than necessary according to my revised timeline. I watched from the bridal suite window as Vivian's college friends stumbled out of their cars, clearly unprepared for such an early start after what appeared to have been a late night of celebration. Vivian herself looked radiant but slightly frazzled, her natural confidence beginning to show small cracks as she realized that her perfect day was starting with unexpected stress. "Bella!" she called out when she saw me, rushing over with the kind of desperate relief that people display when they need someone competent to fix things they don't understand. "Thank God you're here. I don't know why everything feels so rushed this morning. The hairstylist is running behind, and apparently there's some problem with the flowers." "Don't worry about any of that," I said, embracing her with what appeared to be sisterly warmth. "This is your special day, and you shouldn't have to think about logistics. That's what I'm here for. Just focus on being beautiful and happy." I guided her toward the makeup station where the artist was already looking concerned about the compressed timeline. "Actually," I continued, "I had an idea that might help everything feel more relaxed and natural. What if we documented the getting ready process really thoroughly? You know, capture all the authentic moments of preparation, the laughter, the little challenges that make weddings real instead of perfect?" What I was suggesting would add 30 minutes of photography time to an already compressed schedule, ensuring that every subsequent event would be delayed. Vivian's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who didn't understand event logistics. "That sounds amazing. So much more meaningful than those stiff posed photos that everyone does. You're brilliant, Bella. I don't know what I'd do without you today." The irony of her words settled around us like expensive perfume masking something rotten underneath. She truly didn't know what she'd do without me, because every aspect of her perfect day depended on my expertise, my planning, and my intimate knowledge of details she'd never bothered to understand. She was about to marry my former fiancé using my wedding plans, completely dependent on my help to pull off the celebration of their betrayal. The morning progressed with a series of small disasters that appeared random but were actually precisely choreographed. The makeup artist struggled with the early timeline, creating a rushed atmosphere that showed in the tense expressions being captured by David, the photographer, who was documenting every unguarded moment of stress as I'd requested. The hairstylist arrived late, claiming traffic delays that were actually caused by the weekend road construction I'd neglected to mention when suggesting the earlier start time. Marcus arrived looking handsome but visibly nervous, his usual, easy confidence replaced by the jittery energy of someone who was beginning to sense that major life decisions made impulsively might have unforeseen complications. He kept checking his phone and asking questions about timing that revealed he'd never actually reviewed the detailed timeline I'd spent months perfecting for our original wedding. "Bella," he said, approaching me with the careful politeness of someone addressing an ex-fiancé at her former wedding venue. "Thank you for everything you're doing today. I know this situation is unusual, and your grace through all of this means more than you know." "Of course, Marcus," I replied with serene composure that masked the fierce satisfaction of watching him struggle with details he'd never bothered to learn. "I want both of you to have exactly the wedding you deserve. Every couple should experience the natural consequences of their choices, don't you think?" He looked puzzled by my phrasing but was distracted by his best man, who was reporting that several groomsmen were running late due to traffic issues that were actually caused by the peak travel time I'd built into the schedule. The morning was unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of minor chaos, each element designed to create cumulative stress that would build throughout the day. By 10 a.m., the tropical flower situation had escalated beyond simple wilting. Mrs. Chen arrived looking mortified, carrying arrangements that looked like expensive funeral displays after being stored improperly for 2 days. The birds of paradise were drooping dramatically. The elaborate ceremony arch looked like a defeated peacock, and the wax flower arrangements were shedding petals everywhere they were placed. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Chen said, approaching me with tears in her eyes. "I've never had arrangements fail this badly. I don't understand what happened. These flowers should have been fine for today's ceremony." "Don't apologize," I said gently, placing a comforting hand on her arm. Vivian specifically wanted everything to look natural and authentic, not artificially perfect. This rustic, organic look is exactly what she was hoping for. You've created something much more meaningful than those stiff, formal arrangements that everyone else does. Mrs. Chen looked skeptical, but accepted my reassurance, not realizing that I was describing the floral disaster in language that would make Vivian feel embarrassed to complain about something I was framing as her artistic vision. The ceremony was scheduled for noon, but by 11:30, nothing was running on schedule. The earlier hair and makeup timing had created cascading delays, the unstable decorations required constant adjustment by venue staff, and the sound system issues meant that the ceremony would either be inaudible or plagued by feedback screeches that would ruin both the experience and the professional video recording. Guests began arriving to find inadequate parking due to the weekend farmers market I'd forgotten to mention, forcing elderly relatives to walk much farther than expected in formal shoes on uneven gravel. The hilltop ceremony site was already baking in the midday sun, with no shade for guests who dressed for an elegant indoor celebration rather than an exposed outdoor endurance test. "Isabella, we have a problem," Sarah, the wedding planner, said, approaching me with barely controlled panic. "The ceremony site is going to be unbearable for guests by the time we start. The temperature is already 85 degrees up there, and several elderly guests are asking about shade options. Also, the wind is wreaking havoc with the decorations and will make it impossible for guests to hear the vows." I said thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering solutions to problems. I'd engineered. "What if we set up some of those market umbrellas from the reception area? It won't look as elegant, but comfort should come first, and maybe the sound issues will make the ceremony feel more intimate and personal. Sometimes the most meaningful moments are the ones that aren't perfectly audible." Sarah stared at me as if I'd suggested conducting the ceremony underwater. "Isabella, moving the umbrellas will destroy the reception setup, and asking people to strain to hear wedding vows isn't intimate. It's inconsiderate to guests who've traveled to witness this celebration." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "But you know Vivian, she's always been spontaneous and adaptable. She'd rather have an authentic, imperfect ceremony than something that feels too planned and controlled. Why don't you ask her what she prefers? This suggestion was calculated to create exactly the kind of bridal stress that Vivian was least equipped to handle. She'd stolen a wedding without understanding any of the logistics, and now she was being asked to make complex event management decisions under time pressure while wearing a wedding dress and being photographed by a professional who was documenting every moment of her rising panic. The conversation between Sarah and Vivian was visible from across the garden, a tense discussion punctuated by hand gestures and increasingly frantic expressions. Vivian kept looking toward me for support, but I was busy helping other members of the bridal party with last-minute preparations, appearing too occupied to notice her distress. Marcus, meanwhile, was dealing with his own escalating crisis. The groomsmen who'd arrived late were struggling with boutonniere placement because the tropical flowers I'd selected were too heavy and unwieldy for traditional pinning methods. The expensive boutonnieres kept falling off jackets, leaving stains from the flower stems and creating a comedy of errors that was being captured in detail by David's camera. "This is turning into a disaster," I heard Marcus mutter to his best man, unaware that I was within earshot. "Nothing is going according to plan. Vivian seems stressed, the flowers look terrible, and I'm starting to think we should have just eloped instead of trying to pull together a big wedding so quickly." His words were music to my ears. The man who'd left me for my sister because I was too controlling and overplanned everything was discovering what happened when important events weren't carefully orchestrated by someone who understood logistics, vendor management, and the thousand small details that separate successful celebrations from expensive disasters. The ceremony finally began at 12:45, nearly an hour behind schedule, with guests wilting in the afternoon heat and decorations that looked like they'd survived a natural disaster. The sound system issues meant that most of the carefully written vows were inaudible to anyone sitting more than 3 rows from the front, creating an atmosphere of confused squinting and polite nodding rather than emotional connection. Vivian looked beautiful but visibly stressed, her perfect makeup showing signs of perspiration and her elaborate hairstyle beginning to succumb to the relentless wind. Marcus appeared uncomfortable and distracted, frequently glancing at his watch and the increasingly restless crowd of overheated guests. The photographer was capturing every moment of their discomfort, every strained smile, every instance where their perfect day was revealing the hasty, thoughtless planning that had created it. During the vows, a particularly strong gust of wind sent the already unstable ceremony arch crashing into the first row of chairs, narrowly missing Marcus's grandmother and creating a moment of chaos that would forever be preserved in their wedding video. The officiating minister handled the situation gracefully, but the incident perfectly symbolized what I'd been orchestrating all morning: the collapse of stolen dreams built on unstable foundations. The recessional music was barely audible over the wind, and the planned rose petal toss turned into a messy cloud of flower debris that stuck to sweaty guests and created cleanup challenges for the venue staff. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, I saw Vivian's expression clearly for the first time all day. Behind her forced smile was the dawning realization that her perfect wedding was turning into exactly the kind of stressful, problematic event that she would normally mock when it happened to other people. The cocktail reception should have been a recovery period, an opportunity for guests to cool down and for the couple to regroup before the dinner celebration. Instead, it became the second act of their authentic wedding experience. The moved umbrellas had created an aesthetic disaster in the reception space. The raw shellfish appetizers were already showing signs of temperature stress in the outdoor heat, and the bar setup was completely inadequate for the number of guests trying to get drinks simultaneously. "Isabella," Vivian approached me during the cocktail hour, her wedding dress showing visible perspiration stains and her elaborate updo beginning to collapse. "I need to talk to you privately. Something feels really wrong about today, and I can't figure out what's happening." "What do you mean?" I asked with genuine concern, as if I hadn't spent weeks engineering every problem she was experiencing. "Nothing is working the way you described it," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "The flowers look terrible. The ceremony was a disaster. Guests are complaining about the heat. And Marcus seems miserable. This doesn't feel like the perfect wedding you planned. It feels like everything is falling apart." "Oh, honey," I said, taking her hands with sisterly compassion. "This is exactly what authentic, unplanned love looks like. Remember what you told me about how love should be natural and organic, not controlled and scheduled? You're experiencing the real thing instead of some artificial perfection. This is what happens when people follow their hearts instead of rigid timelines and detailed spreadsheets." Vivian stared at me, her expression shifting as she began to understand that I was describing her wedding disaster using the exact words she'd used to describe stealing Marcus from me. For the first time since this whole situation began, I saw genuine fear in her eyes as she realized that her perfect day was becoming a public demonstration of what happened when people made impulsive decisions without understanding the consequences. "But the guests are miserable," she whispered. "And Marcus keeps asking me questions about things I don't know anything about. I thought you had everything handled." "I do have everything handled," I replied calmly. "Everything is going exactly according to plan. Your plan. The plan where love conquers all and details don't matter, because authentic feelings make everything perfect automatically." I smiled at her with the serene confidence of someone who had spent months ensuring that her wedding would be an accurate reflection of her character and choices. As evening approached and the dinner reception prepared to begin, I knew that the final act of their perfect day was about to unfold. The cream puff tower was already showing signs of structural failure in the heat. The entertainment timeline was completely disrupted due to earlier delays, and the transportation logistics for their romantic exit were timed to coincide with the worst possible traffic conditions. But the real masterpiece of their authentic wedding experience was still to come. Their honeymoon in Bali, carefully arranged using all the adventurous activities that Marcus specifically hated, funded by money he'd been saving for our future home, was waiting to demonstrate exactly what happened when people built relationships on lies, betrayal, and the willingness to steal other people's dreams rather than create their own. The dinner reception unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe, disguised as elegant dining. By 7 p.m., the cream puff tower had partially collapsed in the heat, creating a sticky mess that the catering staff was frantically trying to reconstruct, while guests pretended not to notice the dessert disaster happening in full view. The raw shellfish appetizers had been quietly removed after several guests complained of stomach discomfort, leaving conspicuous gaps in the carefully planned menu that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Marcus sat at the head table looking increasingly pale. Whether from the heat, the stress, or the questionable seafood, I couldn't tell. Vivian was making valiant attempts at bride-like radiance, but her forced smiles were becoming more strained with each new mini-crisis that required her attention. The wedding planner kept approaching their table with urgent whispers about timeline adjustments and vendor issues, destroying any possibility of relaxed celebration. I found myself oddly peaceful during this chaos, sitting at the family table and watching their dream day dissolve with the same quiet satisfaction I'd felt when finishing a particularly challenging legal case. Every disaster was evidence of my competence, proof that successful events required the kind of meticulous planning and vendor relationships that couldn't be stolen or borrowed, only earned through experience and expertise. The evening entertainment provided the perfect crescendo to their authentic wedding experience. The band I'd originally hired was excellent, but they were accustomed to working with my detailed timeline and specific song requests. For Vivian's wedding, I'd given them a completely different playlist emphasizing romantic ballads that were beautiful but entirely wrong for the energy level needed to salvage a reception where guests were already exhausted, overheated, and wondering when they could politely leave. "Ladies and gentlemen," the band leader announced as the sun finally began to set, "the bride and groom would like to invite everyone to join them for their first dance as husband and wife." The song I'd selected was a slow, melancholic piece, About enduring love that lasted nearly 6 minutes, an eternity for a couple who were clearly struggling to maintain romantic composure while their celebration crumbled around them. As Marcus and Vivian swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, surrounded by wilted decorations and increasingly restless guests, I saw something in their expressions that made my months of careful planning worthwhile. They were beginning to understand that stealing someone else's life doesn't give you the ability to live it successfully. They had my venue, my vendors, my timeline, and my ex-fiancé. But they didn't have my competence, my relationships, or my understanding of how to transform detailed plans into seamless experiences. The evening's final disaster arrived precisely on schedule. Their romantic exit was planned for 9:30, timed to coincide with weekend traffic that would trap departing guests in the parking lot for at least an hour. The sparkler send-off. I'd arranged required perfect timing and coordination that was impossible with the delayed timeline, overheated guests, and exhausted vendor staff who just wanted to begin cleanup. Isabella! Vivian approached me one final time as guests struggled with sparklers that wouldn't light properly in the evening humidity. I don't understand what happened today. This was supposed to be perfect, but everything felt wrong from the beginning. Did I make a mistake somewhere? What do you mean? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on the day I'd so carefully orchestrated. It felt like none of the vendors really knew me, she said quietly, like they were working from someone else's vision and trying to adapt it for a different person. The flowers weren't my style, the music didn't match my taste, and even the photographer seemed confused about what kind of shots I wanted. She paused, staring at the chaotic sparkler attempt. It felt like I was wearing someone else's wedding dress that didn't quite fit. Her metaphor was more accurate than she realized. She had been wearing someone else's wedding in every possible sense, and the poor fit was exactly what I'd intended her to experience. Maybe that's because you planned everything so quickly, I suggested gently. When you make major decisions impulsively, sometimes the details don't align perfectly with your true preferences. Vivian nodded slowly, but I could see her beginning to understand that the problems went deeper than quick planning. She was starting to recognize that successful events, like successful relationships, required more than good intentions and romantic feelings. They required competence, experience, and the ability to anticipate and prevent problems rather than simply hoping everything would work out naturally. The sparkler send-off finally happened at nearly 10 p.m., with half the guests already departed, and the remaining sparklers creating a pathetic, scattered glow instead of the romantic tunnel of light that required precise coordination. Marcus and Vivian ran through the sparse sparkler display toward their car, which had been decorated by the groomsmen with ribbons and flowers that were already wilting in the humid evening air. As their car disappeared down the gravel drive, leaving behind a reception area that looked like an expensive party supply explosion, I felt a profound sense of completion. They were driving toward their Bali honeymoon with the same oblivious confidence they'd shown when stealing my wedding plans, completely unaware that their romantic adventure was about to become the second act of their education in consequences. The Bali resort I'd helped Vivian select specialized in extreme adventure activities, water sports, and cultural experiences that required physical stamina and cultural sensitivity. Marcus, who got motion sickness on elevators and had once told me that his idea of adventure was trying a new restaurant, was about to spend 10 days in paradise being pushed far beyond his comfort zone by a wife who'd booked activities based on social media photos rather than her husband's actual interests or capabilities. I drove home that night with a curious sense of lightness, as if I'd been carrying a heavy burden that had finally been lifted. The satisfaction wasn't about revenge or schadenfreude, though I'd certainly enjoyed watching their perfect day reveal its true nature. The real satisfaction came from discovering my own strength, my own competence, my own ability to create consequences that reflected people's choices rather than their intentions. 3 days later, my phone rang at 2 a.m. Vivian's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won, and I answered to hear my sister sobbing hysterically from what sounded like a hospital room halfway around the world. "Bella," she gasped between tears, "I need your help. Everything is falling apart here. Marcus is in the hospital. I'm stranded at this resort with no idea how to handle any of this, and I don't know who else to call." "What happened?" I asked, sitting up in bed and turning on the light. Despite everything, she was still my sister, and medical emergencies transcended personal conflicts. "The adventure activities you helped me book," she said, her voice breaking. "Marcus tried to go parasailing because I'd signed us up for it, even though he told me he was scared of heights. He panicked in the air, crashed into the water wrong, and now he has a concussion and possible internal injuries. The resort is saying we're responsible for all the medical costs because we signed waivers, and our insurance doesn't cover extreme sports." I processed this information carefully. The parasailing excursion had been one of several adventure packages that looked exciting in promotional photos, but were clearly inappropriate for someone with Marcus's anxieties and physical limitations. Vivian had booked them because they seemed romantic and spontaneous, without considering whether they matched her husband's actual interests or abilities. "Are you both okay otherwise?" I asked, setting aside my complicated feelings to focus on the immediate crisis. "Physically, maybe," she said. "But Bella, we're not okay. This whole trip has been a disaster. Every activity I planned has been wrong for us. Marcus has been miserable since the first day, and now he's hurt and angry and saying things about our marriage that I don't know how to process. The resort staff treats us like tourists who don't understand basic safety, and I'm realizing that I don't actually know anything about planning trips or managing emergencies or any of the practical things that matter when you're responsible for another person's well-being." Her words carried a depth of realization that went far beyond vacation planning disasters. She was discovering that successful relationships required competence and consideration, not just passion and good intentions. The same impulsiveness that had led her to steal my fiancé was now creating consequences she was completely unprepared to handle. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, already reaching for my laptop to begin researching international medical insurance claims and emergency travel assistance. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never handled anything like this before. You always managed the complicated stuff when we were growing up, and I just assumed that being married would be different, that love would make everything easier somehow. But Marcus is looking at me like he doesn't recognize who I am, and I'm starting to wonder if I don't recognize myself either." Over the next hour, I walked Vivian through the process of contacting their insurance company, communicating with hospital administrators, and arranging for Marcus's medical care. I helped her navigate the bureaucracy of international emergency services, translated resort policies she hadn't bothered to read, and provided the kind of practical support that she'd never learned to give herself or others. "Bella," she said, near the end of our call, her voice small and exhausted. "I think I understand now what Marcus meant when he said you were the competent one. This whole situation has made me realize that I've been living my life assuming someone else would handle the difficult parts. First our parents, then you with all the planning and organizing, and I thought Marcus would just naturally take care of everything I couldn't manage." "What are you realizing?" I asked, curious about her perspective on the lessons her stolen life was teaching her. "That I'm not ready to be anyone's wife," she said quietly. "I'm not ready to be responsible for another person's safety and happiness when I don't even know how to handle basic adulting tasks. I stole your wedding and your fiancé thinking I was getting a perfect life, but I was actually taking on responsibilities I'm completely unprepared for." Her honesty was more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned. She was discovering that successful adult relationships required skills and maturity that couldn't be borrowed or stolen, only developed through experience and genuine growth. The wedding disaster and honeymoon catastrophe were just symptoms of a deeper problem. She'd tried to shortcut her way to happiness without doing the work required to sustain it. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Marcus is talking about annulment when we get home. He says this whole experience has shown him that we made a terrible mistake, that we confused excitement and rebellion with actual compatibility. And honestly, Bella, I think he might be right. I've spent the last few days watching him be miserable and realizing that I don't actually know him well enough to anticipate his needs or make decisions that consider his well-being." When they returned from Bali a week later, Marcus indeed filed for annulment. Their marriage had lasted exactly 10 days, 8 of which were spent discovering that stolen dreams don't transform into sustainable realities without the foundation of genuine compatibility, mutual respect, and practical competence that they'd never bothered to develop. The legal process was swift and uncontested. Marcus moved back in with his parents while he recovered from his injuries and figured out his next steps. Vivian returned to our childhood bedroom, humbled and confused, about how her perfect romantic adventure had dissolved so quickly into expensive chaos and mutual disappointment. I might have felt vindicated by their spectacular failure, but instead I found myself experiencing something more profound and ultimately more valuable. Their collapse had taught me about my own strength, my own worth, and my own ability to create a life based on competence and authenticity rather than drama and impulse. 6 months later, I was promoted to senior partner at my law firm, recognition of the dedication and skill that had been invisible to people who only valued charm and spontaneity. I bought my own house, the one Marcus and I had originally planned to purchase together, and discovered that home ownership was even more satisfying when it represented personal achievement rather than shared compromise. Vivian and I began rebuilding our relationship slowly, based on honesty rather than the superficial harmony our family had always preferred. She started therapy to understand why she'd been so willing to betray someone she claimed to love, and I learned to set boundaries that protected my well-being without requiring me to cut off family connections entirely. "I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding," she told me during one of our careful conversations. "About people experiencing the natural consequences of their choices. I hated hearing it then because it sounded cruel, but I understand now that you were actually offering me a gift." "What kind of gift?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "The gift of learning who I really am when I can't rely on other people's competence to fix my mistakes," she said. "The wedding disaster and the honeymoon catastrophe were horrible to experience, but they taught me things about myself that I never would have learned if everything had worked out perfectly. I learned that I'm not ready for the responsibilities I thought I wanted, and that stealing someone else's life doesn't give you the ability to live it successfully." Our conversation continued for hours, touching on themes of accountability, growth, and the difference between forgiveness and enabling. We talked about our parents' role in creating family dynamics where charm was valued over character, where keeping peace was prioritized over addressing problems, and where appearances mattered more than authentic relationships. "I think our whole family needs to learn how to have real conversations instead of just managing each other's feelings," Vivian said. "We've all been so focused on avoiding conflict that we never learned how to resolve it honestly." She was right, and over the following months, we began modeling a different kind of family relationship. We talked about difficult topics directly, apologized for specific actions rather than general hurt feelings, and created space for growth and change, rather than just forgiveness and forgetfulness. The most surprising development was my relationship with Marcus. He reached out to me 8 months after the annulment, not seeking reconciliation, but offering genuine apology and explanation. We met for coffee, and I discovered that his experience with Vivian had taught him things about himself and about relationships that our more predictable partnership never could have revealed. I realize now that I was attracted to Vivian because she represented everything I thought I was missing, he told me. Spontaneity, adventure, freedom from responsibility. but I learned that those things aren't sustainable foundations for adult relationships. They're just escapism disguised as romance. "What are you doing now?" I asked, curious about how he was rebuilding his life after such a dramatic collapse. "Learning how to be the kind of person who deserves a real partnership," he said. "I'm in therapy. I'm taking responsibility for my choices instead of blaming circumstances, and I'm working on becoming someone who contributes to relationships rather than just consuming them." Our conversation was healing in ways I hadn't expected. Not because we were considering reconciliation, but because we were both acknowledging the growth that had emerged from our painful experiences. The betrayal that had devastated me had ultimately led to discoveries about my own strength and worth that I might never have made otherwise. A year later, I stood in my own garden, hosting a housewarming party for friends and colleagues who knew me as Isabella, the accomplished attorney, not Isabella, the woman whose wedding was stolen by her sister. The gathering was elegant but relaxed, carefully planned but genuinely joyful, reflecting the authentic life I'd built from the wreckage of my stolen dreams. Vivian attended, bringing her new boyfriend, a kind man who valued her growing self-awareness and supported her commitment to personal growth. Marcus sent a thoughtful card but didn't attend, respecting the boundaries we'd established while honoring the genuine friendship that had emerged from our shared experience of consequences and redemption. As I watched my guests enjoying the evening I'd created, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in watching my betrayers fail, but in discovering my own capacity to transform pain into wisdom, chaos into order, and stolen dreams into authentic success. Their betrayal had been meant to diminish me, but instead, it had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed and opened possibilities I'd never considered. The woman who had stayed silent while her sister stole her wedding had evolved into someone who understood that true power came not from revenge, but from the ability to create consequences that reflected reality rather than fantasy. I had learned to build a life so authentic and fulfilling that borrowed dreams couldn't compete with it. That night, as I cleaned up after my guests had gone home, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the painful journey that had led me to this place of genuine contentment. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the catalyst for discovering who we really are when we stop depending on other people's validation and start building lives that reflect our own values and capabilities. The story that began with silence and theft had ended with voice and authenticity, proving that the most powerful transformations often emerge from the most painful experiences when we choose growth over bitterness and wisdom over revenge. 2. Years after what I now called the Great Awakening, I found myself standing in front of a mirror in a boutique wedding dress, but this time the reflection showed a completely different woman. The dress was simple, elegant, chosen by me for me, without committees or stolen dreams or borrowed visions. The woman in the mirror had learned to trust her own judgment, to value her own opinions, and to build a life that didn't require anyone else's permission or approval. "You look radiant," said Elena, the boutique owner who had become more than a vendor. She'd become a friend through our months of working together on what would be my real wedding. "There's something different about brides who know exactly who they are and what they want. You have that confidence." The man I was marrying was David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, whom I'd met during the aftermath of Vivian's floral disaster. He was a crisis management consultant who specialized in helping companies navigate unexpected challenges, and our relationship had grown from mutual respect for each other's competence into something deeper and more sustainable than anything I'd experienced before. We'd met while he was helping his aunt understand how her flowers had failed so dramatically, and I'd been honest about my role in engineering that particular disaster. "I need to tell you something," I'd said during our third coffee date, 6 months after the wedding catastrophe. I wasn't entirely innocent in what happened to those flowers at my sister's wedding. I'd explained everything: the strategic planning, the calculated modifications, the careful orchestration of consequences that had turned their stolen celebration into an expensive lesson in accountability. Instead of being horrified by my confession, David had been intrigued by the sophistication of my approach. "You created a learning experience disguised as a celebration," he'd said thoughtfully. "That's actually brilliant crisis management in reverse. Instead of preventing disasters, you engineered educational consequences." Our relationship had developed around shared values of competence, honesty, and the belief that actions should have meaningful consequences. We'd spent 2 years building something authentic, testing our compatibility through real challenges, traveling together, managing crises together, and learning to support each other's growth rather than simply enjoying each other's company. The wedding we were planning reflected everything I'd learned about the difference between borrowed dreams and authentic choices. Instead of the elaborate estate venue that had represented someone else's vision of elegance, we'd chosen a small art gallery that showcased local artists and supported creative community development. Instead of tropical flowers chosen for dramatic effect, we'd selected seasonal blooms from local growers that reflected our commitment to sustainable practices and community support. "Tell me about the guest list," Elena said as she adjusted the dress's hem. "I love hearing about couples who really think through who they want to witness their commitment." 60 people, I said. "But every single person on that list is someone who knows us well enough to understand why we're choosing each other and who we trust to support our marriage through difficult times as well as celebrations." The list included colleagues who'd watched me rebuild my career after the betrayal, friends who'd supported me through the healing process, family members who'd learned to value authenticity over harmony, and David's extended family who'd welcomed me not as someone to fix or change, but as someone whose strengths complemented their nephews. "What about your sister?" Elena asked gently. She knew enough of my story to understand the complexity of that relationship. "Vivian will be there," I said, "but not as my maid of honor. She's a guest who I hope will continue growing into someone I can trust more completely over time." This decision had required careful consideration and honest conversation with both Vivian and David about boundaries, forgiveness, and the difference between including someone in your celebration and giving them responsibility for your special day. Vivian had accepted this boundary with grace that showed her own growth. "I understand completely," she'd said when I'd explained my decision. "I need to earn back your trust through consistent actions over time, not just through one conversation or apology. Having me as a regular guest is actually more honest about where our relationship is right now." The conversation had been part of a larger family healing process that had taken nearly 2 years to develop. Our parents had initially struggled with what they called my inability to forgive and move on, but had gradually come to understand that healthy relationships required accountability and changed behavior, not just apologies and time passing. "I think what's been hardest for Mom and Dad," I'd explained to David, "is accepting that forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened or going back to the way things were before. Real forgiveness means creating new relationships based on who people actually are now, not who they were before the betrayal or who we wish they could become." This understanding had transformed not just my relationship with Vivian, but my relationships with everyone in my life. I'd learned to distinguish between people who were committed to growth and accountability and those who simply wanted to avoid consequences. I'd developed the skill of maintaining connections with family members while protecting myself from their dysfunction. Most importantly, I'd learned to build new relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or history. David and I had incorporated these lessons into our wedding planning process, making decisions that reflected our actual values rather than tradition or expectation. Instead of a traditional bridal party hierarchy, we'd asked friends to take on specific roles that matched their skills and interests. Instead of a reception focused on entertainment and alcohol, we'd planned an evening that included meaningful conversations, collaborative art making, and activities that would help our different friend groups connect with each other. "The most important thing," I told Elena as she made final adjustments to the dress, is that everything about this wedding reflects who David and I actually are, not who we think we should be or who other people expect us to be. The difference was evident in every detail. Our invitations included a note explaining our values-based gift registry that supported causes we cared about rather than accumulating household items. Our menu featured dishes from both our cultural backgrounds, prepared by a catering company that employed refugees and immigrants. Our ceremony included readings from legal documents about partnership rights alongside traditional vows, reflecting my legal career and our shared commitment to social justice. What I find most interesting, Elena said as we finished the fitting, is how this wedding seems designed to create connection and meaning rather than just celebration and display. She was right. Every choice David and I had made was intended to strengthen relationships and create lasting memories rather than impress guests or fulfill social obligations. We'd learned from watching Vivian's wedding disaster that celebrations without authentic foundation become expensive performances that satisfy no one and create stress for everyone involved. The week before our wedding, I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus. He'd remarried 6 months earlier to a woman he'd met in therapy and was calling to offer congratulations and closure. "I heard through mutual friends that you're getting married next weekend," he said. "I wanted to reach out and say how happy I am for you. From what I understand about David, he sounds like someone who really sees and appreciates who you are." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "I heard about your marriage too. I hope you're both very happy." "We are," he said. "Sarah and I built our relationship very slowly and carefully, with a lot of professional help to make sure we were choosing each other for healthy reasons. I learned so much from what happened with Vivian and me about the difference between excitement and compatibility, between passion and partnership." Our conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on themes of growth, accountability, and the ways that painful experiences can become catalysts for positive change when we're willing to learn from them rather than just recover from them. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said near the end of our call. "The whole situation with Vivian taught me that I'd been attracted to you partly for the wrong reasons. I loved your competence and organization, but I was also using your skills to avoid developing my own. I was letting you handle all the difficult aspects of adult life while I focused on the fun parts." His honesty was refreshing and healing. "I think I was enabling that dynamic too," I admitted. "I enjoyed being needed and appreciated for my planning abilities, but I wasn't requiring you to develop your own capabilities or contribute equally to managing our shared life." "Exactly," he said. And then when Vivian offered what seemed like a relationship without responsibilities, I was attracted to that fantasy rather than recognizing that healthy partnerships require both people to be fully functional adults. We talked about how his relationship with Sarah was different, built on mutual competence and shared responsibility, rather than complementary strengths that could become codependent patterns. He'd learned to manage his own schedule, plan his own travel, and handle his own emotional regulation, rather than depending on his partner to manage those aspects of his life. "The irony," he said, "is that learning to be a complete person on my own has made me a much better partner to Sarah than I ever was to you or Vivian. I can contribute to our relationship from a place of strength rather than need." His words reflected insights that David and I had also discovered in our relationship. We'd spent months in couples counseling before getting engaged. Not because we had problems, but because we wanted to understand our individual patterns and create conscious agreements about how we wanted to build our life together. "One thing I learned," I told Marcus, "is that my strength in planning and organization was real and valuable, but I was also using it to control outcomes and avoid vulnerability. Learning to plan collaboratively with David, to share decision-making and accept that some things can't be controlled, has made me both a stronger person and a better partner." After our call ended, I felt a profound sense of completion about that chapter of my life. Marcus and I had both transformed our painful experience into wisdom that was improving our current relationships. Vivian was doing her own work to become someone capable of healthy partnerships. Even our parents were learning to create more authentic family dynamics based on honest communication rather than conflict avoidance. The night before my wedding, I hosted a small gathering for my closest friends and family members. Instead of a traditional bachelorette party focused on celebrating my last night of freedom, we'd planned an evening of gratitude and intention setting. Each person shared something they'd learned about love and partnership, and I shared my own reflections on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I told the group, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered to me. My relationship, my wedding plans, my faith in family loyalty, my belief that doing the right thing would be rewarded with fair treatment. I paused, looking around at faces that represented the authentic community I'd built. But what I actually lost was my attachment to a life that wasn't really mine, to plans that were based more on expectation than intention, and to relationships that required me to be smaller than I actually am. The room was quiet as I continued. What I gained was the knowledge that I can create a life that reflects my actual values, that I can build relationships based on mutual respect and shared growth, and that my competence and strength are gifts, to be shared with people who appreciate them rather than tools to be used by people who take them for granted. Elena, who had become one of my closest friends, spoke next. What I've watched in Isabella over the past 2 years is someone discovering that she doesn't need anyone else's permission to be fully herself. She's learned to use her strengths consciously and compassionately rather than defensively or manipulatively. Her words captured something essential about my transformation. The woman who had orchestrated her sister's wedding disaster had been operating from a place of hurt and anger, using her skills to create consequences rather than solutions. The woman getting married tomorrow had learned to use those same skills, to build authentic relationships and meaningful celebrations. David's best man, his brother Carlos, had driven down from San Francisco for the wedding and joined our evening gathering. What I've seen in David since he met Isabella, he said, is someone becoming more himself rather than trying to be someone else. She challenges him to be his best self while accepting who he actually is right now. This observation highlighted another crucial difference between my relationship with David and my previous relationship with Marcus. With Marcus, I'd often felt like I was trying to manage or improve him, taking responsibility for his growth and development in ways that ultimately diminished both of us. With David, we challenged each other to grow while taking individual responsibility for our own development. The most important thing I've learned, I said as our gathering concluded, is that real love isn't about finding someone who completes you or fixes you or saves you from yourself. It's about finding someone who sees who you really are and chooses to build something beautiful with that person, while supporting each other's continued growth and evolution. The wedding day itself unfolded with the kind of seamless grace that comes from careful planning combined with authentic intention. Unlike Vivian's disaster, where every detail had been designed to create problems, my wedding with David reflected months of thoughtful preparation aimed at creating meaningful connection and lasting joy. The ceremony took place in the gallery's main exhibition space, surrounded by art that celebrated human creativity and resilience. Our vows were personal and specific, reflecting our individual journeys to this moment and our shared commitment to continued growth. The reception featured conversation stations instead of assigned seating, allowing guests to connect around shared interests and values rather than arbitrary table assignments. "This is the most relaxed wedding I've ever attended," said my colleague, Jennifer, during the reception. "Usually there's so much stress and drama, but this feels like a celebration of something that's already solid and established, rather than a performance of what people hope will happen." Her observation captured exactly what David and I had intended. We weren't asking our guests to witness the beginning of our relationship, but to celebrate our decision to formalize and deepen a partnership that had already proven itself through various challenges and changes. The evening concluded with a collaborative art project where guests contributed to a large canvas that would hang in our home, representing the community support surrounding our marriage. Instead of throwing a bouquet to single women or engaging in other traditions that we found meaningless, we created new rituals that reflected our values and included all our guests regardless of their relationship status. As David and I drove away from our reception, heading not to an exotic honeymoon but to a week at a cabin in the mountains where we planned to hike, read, and simply enjoy each other's company without distractions, I felt the profound satisfaction of having created something authentically mine. "How does it feel?" David asked as we drove through the quiet streets. "To have a wedding that was actually yours from beginning to end?" "Like coming home to myself," I said without hesitation. "Like finally understanding the difference between what I thought I wanted and what actually makes me happy." Our honeymoon was simple, restful, and perfectly suited to who we actually were as people. We spent mornings hiking mountain trails, afternoons reading in comfortable silence, evenings cooking together and talking about our dreams and plans. There were no extreme sports, no exotic locations chosen for social media impact, no activities designed to impress other people or create artificial excitement. "This is what partnership feels like," I told David one evening as we sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset. Not the constant drama and intensity that I used to think meant passion, but this sense of being completely yourself with another person, and having that be not just acceptable, but celebrated. The contrast with both Marcus and Vivian's relationship, disasters, was profound. Where they had chosen excitement and rebellion over compatibility and sustainability, David and I had chosen conscious partnership over unconscious attraction. Where they had focused on what they were escaping from, we had focused on what we were building together. When we returned from our honeymoon, we found a card from Vivian that perfectly captured how much our entire family had grown through the painful events of the past few years. "Dear Isabella and David," she wrote, "watching your wedding helped me understand what authentic celebration looks like. Everything about your day reflected who you really are, rather than who you think you should be. Thank you for showing all of us what healthy relationships can look like when they're built on truth instead of fantasy." The transformation was complete. The woman who had once stayed silent while her dreams were stolen had become someone who created her own dreams so authentic and fulfilling that they couldn't be borrowed or copied by anyone else. The sister who had once stolen what belonged to others had learned to build her own life based on her own values and capabilities. The family that had once prioritized appearance over authenticity had learned to support each other's growth even when it required difficult conversations and uncomfortable changes. Looking back on the journey from betrayal to authentic happiness, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about revenge or justice, but about the power of using painful experiences as catalysts for becoming more fully ourselves. The wedding that was stolen from me had been based on borrowed dreams and unconscious choices. The wedding I created for myself reflected years of conscious growth and authentic self-discovery. Sometimes the greatest gift our betrayers can give us is the opportunity to discover who we really are when we stop trying to be who we think we should be. My sister's theft had forced me to examine every assumption I'd made about love, family, loyalty, and success. The woman who emerged from that examination was stronger, wiser, and more authentically happy than the woman who had lost a wedding, but found herself. 5 years into my marriage with David, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Conference for Women in Leadership, delivering a keynote speech that would have been impossible for the woman I was before my sister's betrayal. The title of my presentation was "Transforming Betrayal into Breakthrough: How Crisis Can Become Your Greatest Teacher." And as I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw reflections of my former self, women who had been knocked down by life's unexpected cruelties and were searching for a path forward. "How many of you," I began, "have had someone you trusted completely turn your world upside down?" Nearly every hand in the audience went up, creating a moment of powerful recognition that we were all connected by shared experiences of human fallibility and resilience. And how many of you spent months or years wondering what was wrong with you that made you deserve such treatment? Again, a forest of hands rose, accompanied by knowing nods and rueful smiles. "I'm here to tell you that you're asking the wrong question," I continued, my voice carrying the confidence that had grown from years of transforming pain into purpose. "The question isn't what's wrong with you. The question is, what strength were you forced to discover that you never would have found otherwise?" This speech had evolved from a workshop I'd started offering through the law firm, initially for colleagues who were struggling with professional betrayals. Clients who had lied, partners who had stolen cases, mentors who had taken credit for their work. But as word spread, the workshop had expanded to include women from all backgrounds who were navigating various forms of personal and professional treachery. "My sister stole my wedding and my fiancé," I said, sharing the story that still had the power to shock audiences with its brazen cruelty. But what she actually gave me was the opportunity to discover that I had been living a borrowed life, trying to fit into someone else's definition of happiness rather than creating my own. The presentation included practical strategies for what I called conscious recovery, a process I'd developed that went far beyond traditional ideas about healing from betrayal. Instead of focusing solely on emotional recovery or forgiveness, conscious recovery emphasized using crisis as an opportunity for radical self-examination and intentional life redesign. Traditional advice tells us to forgive and move on, I explained to the audience. But that approach often keeps us stuck in the same patterns that made us vulnerable to betrayal in the first place. Conscious recovery asks us to get curious about why we attracted or accepted certain behaviors, what beliefs we were operating from that didn't serve us, and how we can use this painful experience to become more authentically ourselves. The cause? Methodology had 5 core principles that I'd refined through years of personal application and professional practice. First was radical honesty, the willingness to examine our own contributions to problematic situations without self-blame or victim shaming. Second was strategic detachment, learning to observe our emotions and reactions rather than being controlled by them. Third was competence building, developing practical skills that increased our independence and confidence. Fourth was conscious relationship design, creating new relationships based on explicit agreements and shared values rather than assumptions and hope. Fifth was purpose integration, using our experiences to serve others facing similar challenges. The woman who had her wedding stolen was passive, naive, and dependent on other people's approval, I told the audience. The woman standing before you today has built a life so authentic and fulfilling that it can't be stolen, borrowed, or replicated because it's specifically designed around my unique strengths, values, and purpose. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Isabella," she said, using the title I'd earned by completing my doctorate in organizational psychology while building my speaking career. "How do you help people who say they want to grow from betrayal but keep making the same mistakes? Over and over?" "That's one of the most important questions you can ask," I replied, "because it touches on the difference between intellectual understanding and embodied transformation." I paused, thinking about clients I'd worked with who struggled with this exact issue. Real change happens when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of being different. Some people need to experience multiple betrayals before they're ready to examine their own patterns honestly. Another audience member asked about forgiveness, the topic that always came up when I spoke about betrayal recovery. I've heard conflicting advice about whether forgiveness is necessary for healing. What's your perspective? Forgiveness is a luxury, not a requirement, I said, a statement that usually surprised audiences accustomed to more traditional therapeutic approaches. What's required is releasing the emotional charge around what happened so it doesn't continue controlling your life. Sometimes that happens through forgiveness, sometimes through acceptance, sometimes through understanding, and sometimes simply through time and distance. I explained how my relationship with Vivian had evolved into something healthier than traditional forgiveness. We maintained contact and had rebuilt trust gradually, but our relationship was fundamentally different than it had been before her betrayal. We're friendly, but we're not best friends. We share family occasions, but we don't share secrets. I wish her well, but I don't depend on her for anything important. That's not forgiveness. That's wisdom. After the conference, I drove to the airport thinking about how my life had become a case study in conscious transformation. The law firm had promoted me to managing partner, partly because of my ability to navigate complex conflicts and partly because my speaking and consulting work had brought positive attention to the practice. David and I had bought a larger house where we hosted monthly dinners for couples who were intentionally building healthy relationships. We'd written a book together about conscious partnership that had become required reading for several graduate psychology programs. Most surprisingly, I'd become someone other people sought out for advice about handling betrayal, divorce, family conflicts, and professional challenges. The skills I'd developed through my own crisis had become valuable resources for others facing similar situations. The flight home gave me time to reflect on a conversation I'd had earlier that week with Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist who had helped me navigate the initial aftermath of Vivian's betrayal. She'd called to tell me about a client who was struggling with a situation remarkably similar to mine. A sister who had stolen her boyfriend and was now planning to use her wedding plans for their celebration. "I recommended your book and suggested she attend one of your workshops," Dr. Williams had said. "But I also wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak with her privately. Sometimes people need to hear from someone who's been through exactly what they're experiencing." The request had made me think about how my personal disaster had become a source of healing for others. Not in a savior complex way, but in the recognition that our most painful experiences often contain the seeds of our greatest contributions to the world. "What fascinates me about your journey," Dr. Williams had continued, "is how you've managed to transform a deeply personal betrayal into a professional calling without becoming bitter or cynical. Most people who experience what you went through either remain victims or become vengeful. You found a third path. That third path had required constant conscious choice. Every day I had to decide whether to use my experiences to build something positive or to remain focused on what had been taken from me. The choice to become someone who helped others navigate similar challenges had been one of the most healing aspects of my recovery. When I arrived home, David was in his office finishing a crisis management consultation with a tech company whose CEO had been embezzling funds. His work had evolved too, from managing corporate disasters to helping organizations build cultures that prevented crises rather than just responding to them. "How was the keynote?" he asked, looking up from his laptop with the smile that still made me grateful every day for the authentic partnership we'd created. "Powerful," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. I keep being amazed by how many people are walking around carrying the weight of betrayals they haven't processed consciously. The whole audience lit up when I talked about using crisis as a catalyst for becoming more authentically themselves. "That makes sense," David said, closing his laptop to give me his full attention. "Most people are taught to recover from difficult experiences, not to use them as opportunities for upgrade their entire approach to life." We talked about the workshop requests that had been pouring in, including invitations to speak at corporations, universities, and therapeutic organizations around the world. What had started as a personal healing journey had evolved into what felt like a calling to help others transform their own experiences of betrayal and disappointment. "I got an interesting call today, too," David said. "The International Crisis Management Association wants us to present together at their annual conference about preventing personal and professional disasters through conscious relationship building. The invitation represented another evolution in how our individual healing had become collaborative service. David's expertise in organizational crisis prevention, combined with my knowledge of personal betrayal recovery, had created a unique perspective on how individuals and institutions could build resilience before disasters occurred. What would we focus on? I asked, already thinking about how personal relationship skills translated to professional environments. The same principles you teach individuals, David said. Radical honesty about what's actually happening rather than what we wish were happening. Strategic detachment from outcomes we can't control. Competence building in areas where we've been dependent on others. Conscious agreement making instead of assumption-based relationships. As we discussed the presentation, I realized how completely my life had transformed from what it had been during my relationship with Marcus. That version of myself had been reactive, dependent on external validation, and focused on avoiding conflict rather than addressing problems directly. The woman I'd become was proactive, internally grounded, and skilled at navigating difficult conversations with grace and effectiveness. The next morning brought news that perfectly illustrated how dramatically life had changed for everyone involved in the original betrayal. Vivian called to tell me that she'd been promoted to creative director at the nonprofit where she'd been working since her divorce from Marcus. More significantly, she was engaged to a man who knew her complete history and had chosen her anyway, after watching her consistently demonstrate growth and accountability over 2 years of dating. "I wanted you to hear it from me first," she said, her voice carrying a maturity that had been completely absent during the period when she'd stolen my wedding. "And I wanted to thank you for showing me what authentic relationships look like through your marriage with David. Watching how you two navigate challenges together taught me things about partnership that I never learned growing up." "I'm happy for you," I said, and meant it completely. Vivian's growth had been genuine and sustained, demonstrated through her career advancement, her therapeutic work, and her commitment to making amends for past behavior through changed actions rather than just apologies. "There's something else," she continued. "James and I want to have a very small wedding, just immediate family and closest friends. We're not asking you to be involved in planning or anything like that, but we'd love to have you and David there, if you're comfortable with it." The invitation represented how much our relationship had evolved. Instead of the dramatic, elaborate celebration she'd once coveted, Vivian was planning a simple ceremony that reflected her actual values and resources. Instead of stealing someone else's vision, she was creating something authentic to her relationship with James. "We'd be honored to attend," I said. "And Vivian, I'm proud of who you've become through all of this. The work you've done to understand yourself and change your patterns has been impressive to witness." After our call ended, I felt a profound sense of completion about that chapter of our family's story. Everyone involved had used the original crisis as an opportunity for growth rather than just recovery. Marcus had remarried successfully and was thriving in his work as a financial advisor who specialized in helping couples make money decisions together. Our parents had entered couples therapy and were learning to communicate directly rather than through their daughters. Even the vendors from the original wedding disaster had grown from the experience. Mrs. Chen had expanded her business and now offered crisis management services for other event professionals. The ripple effects of conscious transformation had extended far beyond the original situation, touching everyone who had been willing to examine their patterns and make different choices. That afternoon, I received a call that would represent the next evolution of my work. Dr. Angela Martinez from Harvard Business School was inviting me to develop a curriculum about betrayal recovery and conscious relationship building for their executive leadership program. "We're seeing increasing incidents of professional betrayal, embezzlement, corporate espionage, partnership violations," she explained. "But traditional approaches to handling these situations focus on legal remedies and damage control. We're interested in your perspective on how individuals and organizations can use betrayal experiences as opportunities for systemic improvement. The invitation represented recognition that the principles I'd developed through personal experience had applications far beyond individual healing. Organizations were beginning to understand that building cultures of integrity and conscious relationship required the same skills that individuals needed to recover from betrayal and create authentic lives. What we're particularly interested in, Dr. Martinez continued, is your framework for distinguishing between people who are genuinely committed to growth versus those who are simply trying to avoid consequences. That skill seems crucial for leaders who need to make decisions about second chances and organizational trust. The conversation excited me because it represented the highest possible use of my painful experiences, helping create systems that prevented others from experiencing similar betrayals while building more resilient individuals and organizations. As I hung up from that call, I looked around my home office, which had become the headquarters for work that felt more like mission than career. The walls were covered with letters from workshop participants, photos from speaking engagements, and certificates from the various credentials I'd earned to better serve others facing similar challenges. The woman who had once stayed silent while her dreams were stolen had become someone whose voice was sought out by people around the world, who were learning to transform their own experiences of betrayal into breakthrough. The sister who had once been the victim of family dysfunction had become someone who helped other families learn to navigate conflict with integrity and growth. Most importantly, the person who had once depended on others for validation and security had become someone who created her own sense of worth and built relationships that enhanced rather than completed her. The marriage that had been built on conscious choice rather than unconscious attraction continued to deepen and strengthen, providing a stable foundation for work that required emotional resilience and authentic compassion. That evening, as David and I prepared dinner together, a ritual that had become sacred time for connection and conversation, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment of authentic success and meaningful service. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Vivian hadn't stolen your wedding? David asked as we chopped vegetables side by side. Never, I said without hesitation. Because that betrayal led to everything good in my life now. It forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I had, to examine beliefs that weren't serving me, and to create a life based on my actual values rather than other people's expectations. The transformation had been complete and irreversible. The woman who had emerged from betrayal was someone who could never be diminished by external circumstances, because she had learned to create security, meaning, and joy from internal resources that couldn't be stolen or borrowed or destroyed by anyone else's choices. Sometimes the greatest gift our betrayers give us is the opportunity to discover who we really are when we stop trying to be who we think we should be. In stealing my dreams, my sister had forced me to create better ones. In teaching me that I couldn't depend on others for my happiness, she had inadvertently given me the greatest possible freedom, the knowledge that I could create a life so authentic and fulfilling that external validation became optional rather than essential. The story that had begun with silence and theft had become one of voice and creation, proving that the most powerful transformations often emerge from the most painful experiences when we choose growth over bitterness and service over self-pity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.